10 things we got completely wrong about prehistoric humans. All right, let's go. Number 10. Human evolution was a straight line. Open any old textbook and you'll find it. The march of progress. A neat row of figures marching left to right. A hunched, knuckle-dragging ape on the left. A modern human standing tall on the right. In between, a clean, orderly sequence. Each one a little less hairy, a little more upright, a little smarter than the last. It's probably the most reproduced scientific illustration in history, and it is almost entirely wrong. The idea that human evolution moved in a straight line, that there was one lineage, one path, one clear trajectory from primitive to modern, was never supported by the fossil evidence. Not even when that image was first published in 1965. The scientist who drew it, Rudolf Zallinger, wasn't even trying to make a scientific argument. It was a fold-out illustration for a time-life book. But it lodged itself in the public imagination so deeply that it shaped how people thought about our origins for decades. Here's what the fossil record actually shows. Human evolution was not a ladder. It was a bush. At various points in the last 3 million years, there were anywhere from 6 to 12 different hominin species walking the earth at the same time, not in sequence. Simultaneously, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit humans of Indonesia, Homo naledi in South Africa. These weren't steps on a staircase. They were branches, cousins, competitors, and in some cases neighbors. Homo floresiensis is a good example of how strange this really gets. For a long time, scientists assumed that once modern humans appeared, the older, smaller-brained species died out or were replaced. Floresiensis blew that assumption apart. These were tiny humans, about a meter tall, with brains roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, and they were living on the island of Flores in Indonesia until as recently as 50,000 years ago. That's not ancient history. That's the same era when modern humans were painting caves in Europe. Different species of human, alive at the same time, on opposite ends of the same planet. And it gets stranger. Homo naledi, discovered in a South African cave system in 2013, had a brain about the size of an orange. Small, primitive by many measures. And yet the evidence suggests they were deliberately disposing of their dead in deep, hard-to-reach cave chambers, behavior we associate with complex thought, ritual, maybe even grief. A creature with a tiny brain doing something that looks disturbingly like a funeral. The straight-line model didn't just get the shape of evolution wrong. It smuggled in a hierarchy. It implied that each stage was an improvement on the last, that newer meant smarter, better, more valuable. That bias infected everything. How we thought about living indigenous populations, how we treated archaeological evidence that didn't fit the narrative, how we imagined what it meant to be primitive. The march of progress wasn't just bad science. It was a convenient story that told modern humans they were the point of the whole thing, the destination, the winner. The actual story is messier, stranger, and far more interesting. We are not the end of a line. We are one surviving branch of a tree that had many branches, most of which are gone. And the reason we're the ones left standing isn't entirely clear. It may have been luck as much as anything else. Number 9. Neanderthals were stupid brutes. If the march of progress gave us the wrong shape for evolution, it gave us the worst possible picture of Neanderthals. The image that stuck, the one that became a cultural shorthand for stupidity and backwardness, was a hunched, slack-jawed, club-wielding brute, barely conscious, driven purely by hunger and aggression. More animal than human, that image was based on a single skeleton, one individual, discovered in France in 1908, reconstructed by the French paleontologist Marcellin Boule, who concluded that Neanderthals walked with bent knees and couldn't stand upright, had no capacity for speech, and were essentially just a dead end, a failed experiment on the road to real humans. His reconstruction was so influential that it defined the public image of Neanderthals for most of the 20th century. There was one problem. The skeleton Boule was working from was an elderly male with severe arthritis. He was misreading a diseased individual as a representative specimen. Later researchers who re-examined the same bones concluded that Neanderthals walked completely upright. Their posture was essentially identical to ours. But that was just the beginning of the rehabilitation. Over the past 30 years, the evidence for Neanderthal sophistication has accumulated to the point where it's become impossible to dismiss. Neanderthals buried their dead, not just abandoned them, deliberately placed them in the ground, sometimes with objects. At the Shanidar cave site in Iraq, a Neanderthal burial was found surrounded by clumps of pollen from 8 different plant species, several of which have medicinal properties. This has been contested. Some researchers argue the pollen was deposited by natural means, but the burial itself is not in doubt. They made jewelry. Eagle talons with cut marks and traces of adhesive, suggesting they were strung into necklaces or pendants. Pierced shells painted with ochre. These objects predate the arrival of modern humans in Europe, meaning Neanderthals developed ornamental behavior independently, without copying it from us. They made tools that were, by some measures, more sophisticated than those of contemporary Homo sapiens. The Mousterian tool industry associated with Neanderthals included carefully shaped points, scrapers, and blades. They hafted tools, attached stone points to wooden handles, which requires planning, adhesive production, and multi-step manufacturing. They hunted large game. They controlled fire. They cooked food. And then there's the DNA evidence, which changed everything. In 2010, Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome. What they found was extraordinary. Modern humans outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, not as a curiosity, as functional genetic material that shapes immune response, skin and hair characteristics, and potentially neurological traits. We interbred with Neanderthals, multiple times, in multiple locations. They are not our failed predecessors. They are, in a very real sense, our ancestors. The brute image died hard. It's still hanging around in casual language. Calling someone a Neanderthal is still an insult. But the science has moved on completely. What we actually lost when Neanderthals disappeared around 40,000 years ago wasn't a lesser form of humanity. It was a different kind of human, one that had survived ice ages, mastered fire, made art, buried its dead, and left a permanent mark on our genome. That's not a failed experiment. That's a tragedy. Number 8. Cavemen dragged women by the hair. This one isn't just wrong. It was invented, completely fabricated, and the invention can be traced to a specific moment in history. The image, brutish prehistoric male grabs female by the hair, drags her back to cave. appears nowhere in the actual archaeological record. There are no cave paintings depicting it, no fossil evidence supporting it, no anthropological data suggesting it was a common or accepted behavior. The image came from Victorian-era fiction, specifically a genre of novels and illustrations in the 1870s and 1880s that imagined prehistoric life as a kind of primal free-for-all, where strength was the only law and women were property. One of the earliest and most influential sources was a French novel called La Guerre du Feu, The Quest for Fire, published in 1911 by J.H. Rosny-Aine. The story depicted prehistoric humans as barely distinguishable from animals, driven by instinct, with females taken by force. Hollywood ran with it. From the silent film era onward, the hair-dragging caveman became a stock image, comic, villainous, or both depending on the context. By the mid-20th century, it was a cultural fixture. Cartoons, greeting cards, Halloween costumes. What does the actual evidence show about gender relations in prehistoric societies? It's complicated, and the evidence is fragmentary, but what we have doesn't support the brutish domination model at all. Burial patterns are one of the best indicators we have of social status. In many early modern human sites, male and female burials contain comparable grave goods, similar tools, similar ornaments, similar indicators of social investment in the individual. This doesn't prove equality in the modern sense, but it doesn't suggest the extreme hierarchy the hair-dragging image implies. Hunter-gatherer societies that persist today, often used as imperfect analogs for prehistoric social organization, show enormous variation. Some are patriarchal. Some are strikingly egalitarian. The Aka people of Central Africa are famous for the degree of male involvement in childcare. The Kungsan of the Kalahari have social norms that actively suppress dominance behavior and prestige accumulation in men. These aren't outliers. They represent a real range. There's also isotopic evidence from prehistoric skeletons suggesting that in some populations, women traveled farther from their birth sites than men, the opposite of what a model of female captivity would predict. And there's genetic evidence suggesting that in many prehistoric populations, mating patterns were diverse and not concentrated among dominant males. The picture, in short, looks nothing like a Flintstones episode. The hair-dragging image tells us more about Victorian anxieties than it does about prehistoric reality. It was a way of projecting certain assumptions about natural gender hierarchy backward into deep time, making them seem not just culturally normal, but biologically inevitable. The archaeology refuses to cooperate. Number 7. Prehistoric humans lived short, brutal lives. Ask most people how long prehistoric humans lived, and they'll say something like 30 or 35 years. Maybe 40 if they were lucky. Short, painful lives punctuated by constant danger, disease, and starvation. This idea is so widespread, it's become a kind of shorthand for everything that's supposed to be bad about the pre-modern world. The number isn't made up. It comes from real data. Average life expectancy at birth in many prehistoric populations was indeed somewhere in the range of 25 to 35 years. But that number is doing something statistically sneaky that almost nobody notices when they repeat it. Average life expectancy at birth is devastated by child mortality. If half the children in a population die before age 5, which was roughly the situation in most pre-modern societies, the average lifespan of everyone in that population drops dramatically, even if the adults who survive childhood go on to live long lives. You can have a population where most adults live into their 60s and still have an average life expectancy at birth of 35, purely because so many infants die. When researchers look at conditional life expectancy, meaning how long could you expect to live if you survived to adulthood, the picture changes completely. Analysis of skeletal remains from prehistoric populations in Europe and North America suggests that adults who made it to 15 could often expect to live another 40 to 50 years. That puts them dying in their mid-50s to mid-60s. Not as long as modern life expectancy, but not the brutish, short existence the mythology suggests. There's supporting evidence from the archaeological record itself. Skeletons of elderly individuals, people who lived well into their 50s, 60s, and sometimes 70s, are not uncommon in prehistoric sites. Many of these individuals show evidence of long-term illness or disability, degenerative joint disease, healed fractures, missing limbs, and in many cases, the bone evidence suggests these individuals survived for years or even decades, with conditions that would have prevented them from contributing physically to the group. That's significant. If prehistoric life was purely a brutal competition where only the strong survived, you would not expect to find elderly, disabled individuals in hunter-gatherer groups, people who consumed resources without being able to replenish them. The fact that they existed and that their groups apparently sustained them suggests something that looks a lot like care. Social investment in individuals who couldn't pull their own weight by conventional measures. The skeleton known as Shanidar I, a Neanderthal male from the same Iraqi cave site mentioned earlier, had a withered right arm that showed signs of amputation or atrophy, significant vision loss in the left eye, and severe arthritis throughout his body. He survived to approximately 40 to 50 years of age, old for a Neanderthal, and the extent of his disabilities means he almost certainly required sustained care from others. The same pattern appears in Homo sapiens populations. Prehistoric humans looked after each other. The idea of a ruthless, unsentimental existence where the weak were simply abandoned turns out to be a projection, not a fact. Number 6. There was one type of prehistoric human. When we say caveman, we tend to picture a single type, one generic prehistoric human, maybe a bit hairy, a bit stooped, carrying a club, living in a cave, obviously. The image flattens thousands of generations of human diversity into a single figure, and it obscures something that should genuinely change how you think about our past. For most of the last 3 million years, the Earth was inhabited by multiple species of humans at the same time, not just Neanderthals and us. At the peak of hominin diversity, roughly 300,000 years ago, there may have been 6 or more distinct human species alive simultaneously on different continents, each with its own anatomy, its own tool traditions, its own range, each responding to its own ecological pressures. We've already talked about Homo floresiensis, the tiny-brained hobbit humans of Indonesia. But consider Homo luzonensis, discovered in 2019 in the Philippines, who may have been living on Luzon Island as recently as 67,000 years ago. Or Homo naledi, with its primitive body plan and apparently deliberate mortuary behavior. Or the Denisovans, a species we didn't even know existed until 2010, identified not from a complete skeleton, but from a single finger bone and a couple of teeth, their entire existence reconstructed from ancient DNA. The Denisovan case is extraordinary. We have no clear picture of what they looked like. We know they existed because their DNA showed up in that finger bone from Denisova Cave in Siberia, and because they left genetic traces in the modern populations of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Indigenous Australians and Melanesians carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA, a legacy of interbreeding that happened somewhere in Asia tens of thousands of years ago, with a species we still haven't found a complete fossil of. And these weren't just geographically isolated populations that never interacted. The evidence increasingly suggests that different hominin species encountered each other, lived in overlapping ranges, competed for resources, and interbred. Modern humans aren't a pure lineage descending from a single ancestral population. We are the genetic residue of multiple contact events between species that scientists once treated as completely separate branches of the family tree. The single caveman archetype doesn't just misrepresent what prehistoric humans looked like. It misrepresents the nature of our existence. We did not emerge in isolation. We are a hybrid, a composite, the product of encounters between different kinds of humans across hundreds of thousands of years. The Jerick Caveman is a fiction that makes an almost incomprehensibly complex history feel simple and manageable. The real story is something else entirely. Number 5. Cave paintings were primitive scribbles. There's a condescension built into the way we used to talk about prehistoric art. The assumption was that cave paintings were simple, instinctive, maybe accidental, the marks left by minds that hadn't yet developed true complexity. Stone Age doodling. Evidence of emerging consciousness, sure, but nothing you'd call sophisticated. That assumption has been methodically demolished over the past 3 decades. And the more researchers look at the actual paintings, the more sophisticated they turn out to be. Start with the basics. The oldest known cave art is not in France or Spain, where the most famous sites are. It's in Indonesia. A painting in Liang Bulu Sipong Cave in Sulawesi depicts a hunting scene, humans and animals, and has been dated to at least 43,900 years ago. Individual hand stencils and animal images at nearby sites have been dated to at least 45,500 years ago. These aren't early experiments in a tradition that would later become sophisticated. They are already sophisticated at their oldest known point. The techniques used by prehistoric painters were not primitive. Analysis of the pigments in Lascaux and other major French caves shows that the painters used a palette of colors: red and yellow ochre, black manganese dioxide, charcoal, and mixed them with substances including animal fat, plant juices, and calcium-rich ground bone. They heated ochre to change its color. They blended pigments to achieve specific hues. They used brushes made from animal hair, pads of moss or fur, and their own hands and mouths to apply paint. Some of the paintings were done by blowing pigment through tubes, essentially prehistoric airbrushes. And then there's the placement. These paintings were not made in the lit, accessible areas of caves where people would have camped and lived. They were made deep underground, in narrow passages and chambers that required crawling through the dark with only small fat-burning lamps for light. Getting to some of these painting sites would have been genuinely dangerous. The choice to paint there, rather than at the cave entrance or outside, was deliberate. This was not casual decoration. The subject matter follows patterns that look almost liturgical. Certain animals appear again and again across thousands of miles of European cave sites: horses, aurochs, bison, mammoths. while other animals that would have been common in the environment are almost entirely absent. The selection isn't random. It reflects deliberate choices about what was worth depicting, which implies a symbolic or ritual framework we can barely reconstruct. Some researchers have argued that the cave paintings show evidence of intentional narrative, sequences that suggest motion, time, and causality. A horse shown in multiple positions within a single panel, suggesting movement, overlapping images that create depth. Whether or not these rise to the level of true sequential narrative, they represent a visual complexity that took trained painters in later historical periods centuries to develop. The people who made these paintings were not primitive. They were modern humans with modern brains, engaged in a practice that was clearly important to their communities in ways we are still trying to understand. Calling it primitive scribbling says far more about our own condescension than it does about what's on the cave walls. Number 4. The paleo diet is what prehistoric humans actually ate. This one requires a specific kind of correction, because the paleo diet, as marketed, is not entirely fictional. It contains real ideas about prehistoric nutrition, but it cherry-picks and distorts the evidence in ways that are worth unpacking. The basic claim of the paleo diet movement is that modern humans are best adapted to eat what our Paleolithic ancestors ate, primarily meat, fish, eggs, vegetables, fruits, and nuts, while avoiding grains, legumes, dairy, and processed foods. The evolutionary logic is superficially appealing. We evolved over millions of years on a particular diet, and our bodies are optimized for that diet. Modern agricultural foods are too recent for our genetics to have caught up with. Here's where the evidence gets complicated. First, prehistoric human diet was not dominated by meat. This is the most persistent misconception, and it's one the paleo diet movement leans into heavily. The image of the mighty hunter dragging home a mammoth obscures the reality that for most prehistoric populations in most environments, plant foods made up the majority of caloric intake. Starch granules have been found on prehistoric grinding stones and on the dental calcite of prehistoric teeth going back 200,000 years or more. Ancient humans were processing grains and root vegetables long before the agricultural revolution. They were not avoiding starch. They were going to considerable effort to obtain it. The isotopic analysis of prehistoric bone collagen, which gives a reliable signal of what someone ate over years of life, shows enormous variation across populations and environments. Arctic populations ate primarily meat because they had to. Plants weren't available. Tropical and temperate populations show much higher plant consumption. There was no single paleo diet. There was a spectrum of diets adapted to local conditions, which is exactly what you'd expect from a species that colonized every terrestrial environment on Earth. Second, the claim that agricultural foods are too new for human genetics is overstated. Human evolution did not stop at the end of the Paleolithic. The ability to digest lactose into adulthood, lactase persistence, evolved independently in multiple populations within the last 10,000 years, coinciding with the domestication of cattle. Amylase gene copy number, which affects the ability to digest starch, varies between populations in ways that correlate with historical dietary patterns. Humans adapted to agriculture rapidly by evolutionary standards. Third, the paleo diet as sold is largely a reconstruction based on modern analogs, what contemporary hunter-gatherer societies eat, filtered through food preferences that are culturally specific to wealthy Western consumers. The emphasis is on large cuts of muscle meat, for instance, diverges from what we know about actual hunter-gatherer consumption patterns, which typically involved eating the entire animal, including organs, bone marrow, and other nutrient-dense parts that don't feature prominently in trendy restaurant menus. None of this means the core insight is entirely wrong. Avoiding heavily processed foods is probably good advice. The problem is the mythology layered on top, the idea of one pure ancestral diet, the dismissal of grains as evolutionary poison, the specific claim that modern humans are uniquely adapted to high-protein, low-carbohydrate eating. The prehistoric humans on whose supposed diet this is based ate what was available, which was different depending on where and when they lived. They were not following a program. Number 3. Prehistoric humans were isolated and never traveled far. The word prehistoric tends to conjure a picture of small scattered groups, each one clinging to its own territory, separated from other groups by vast distances, rarely, if ever, in contact. Tribes in isolation, unaware of each other's existence. It's a picture of a world before connection, before networks, before the movement of people and goods that we associate with civilization. The archaeological evidence has been systematically dismantling this picture for 30 years. Start with the obsidian trade networks. Obsidian is a volcanic glass that fractures into razor-sharp edges, making it exceptionally useful for cutting tools. It's also geologically distinctive. The chemical signature of obsidian from a particular volcano is identifiable and consistent, which means archaeologists can trace obsidian tools back to their source. What they've found is that obsidian moved a lot. Obsidian sourced from specific volcanic sites in Anatolia, modern Turkey, has been found at sites more than 700 kilometers away, dating to more than 10,000 years ago. In the Pacific, obsidian from the Admiralty Islands in Papua New Guinea was being distributed to sites across a network spanning more than 3,000 kilometers as early as 20,000 years ago. These are not accidental distributions. They represent sustained, intentional exchange networks operating across enormous distances. Shells tell the same story. Marine shells from the Mediterranean coast have been found at inland sites hundreds of kilometers away in contexts suggesting they were used as ornaments or currency. Spondylus shells from the Aegean show up in Neolithic sites in Central Europe. Cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean appear in sites across sub-Saharan Africa. Each of these distributions represents a chain of exchange, goods moving hand to hand across networks of contact that spanned entire continents. The movement wasn't just goods. It was people. Ancient DNA analysis has transformed our understanding of prehistoric population mobility in the last decade. What it shows consistently is that prehistoric populations were not static. They moved. They replaced each other. They admixed. The people living in Europe 10,000 years ago were largely replaced by incoming farmers from Anatolia around 8,000 years ago, who were themselves later substantially replaced and admixed with incoming pastoralists from the Pontic steppe around 5,000 years ago. These were not gradual drifts. They were substantial population movements that left clear genetic signals. In the Americas, ancient DNA from sites across North and South America shows that the initial colonization of the continent, which happened some time before 15,000 years ago, possibly significantly earlier, involved multiple founding populations that spread with extraordinary speed. The genetic diversity of ancient American populations and the speed with which humans reached the southern tip of South America after arriving in the north implies movement rates that questions the idea of slow, cautious expansion by isolated groups. Prehistoric humans were travelers. They were traders. They were migrants. The world they inhabited was not a patchwork of sealed-off territories. It was a web of connections, some loose, some dense, spanning distances that would challenge many modern travelers. Number 2. Prehistoric humans were always at war. The idea that human violence is ancient, natural, and essentially unavoidable has a long intellectual history. Thomas Hobbes famously described life in the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, a war of all against all. In the late 20th century, a wave of popular books argued that the evidence supported this view, that prehistoric societies were extraordinarily violent, that raiding and massacre were endemic, and that war was not a product of civilization, but a feature of the deep human past. The most cited evidence was skeletal, traumatic injuries, healed and unhealed fractures consistent with violence, mass burial sites. The argument was that if you looked at the archaeological record honestly, it was full of evidence of prehistoric violence, and that modern hunter-gatherers, used as proxies for prehistoric people, showed high rates of violent death. This argument isn't entirely wrong. There is genuine evidence of prehistoric violence. The Talheim massacre in Germany, around 7,000 years ago, a mass grave of 34 individuals killed by blows to the head. The Crow Creek massacre in South Dakota, around 800 years ago, nearly 500 individuals in a mass grave, many showing evidence of scalping and mutilation. Violence happened. It was sometimes catastrophic, but the question is whether it was constant, endemic, and representative of prehistoric life generally. And here, the evidence is much more complicated. The skeletal data depends heavily on which sites you include. The studies showing very high prehistoric violence rates often draw heavily on sites from specific times and regions. The European Neolithic, which was a period of significant upheaval related to population movements, or specific sites in the American Great Plains during a period of climatic stress and resource competition. When researchers try to compile more comprehensive, globally representative samples of prehistoric skeletal trauma, the average rates of violence are much lower, often comparable to or lower than rates in historical societies. The modern hunter-gatherer data is similarly complicated. Some hunter-gatherer groups, particularly those in resource-stressed environments or in contact with expanding agricultural populations, show high rates of violent death. Others show very low rates. The variance is enormous, and using any particular group as a proxy for prehistoric humans in general is methodologically dubious. There's also a sampling bias problem. The sites that attract archaeological attention are often unusual. Mass graves get excavated and studied because they're dramatic. Peaceful burials of individuals who died of old age or illness don't make the news. The record is skewed toward spectacular violence in ways that distort any attempt to calculate overall rates. The most careful and comprehensive meta-analysis of the evidence, published in 2013 by researchers including Douglas Fry and Patrick Soderberg, concluded that the evidence for war, organized, group-against-group lethal violence in the Paleolithic is actually quite thin. Individual violence occurred. Homicide occurred. But the coordinated raiding and warfare that characterizes historical states and chiefdoms does not appear to have been the default condition of prehistoric human life. It may have become more common with the development of sedentary agriculture, when territory became something worth defending, and when population density created the conditions for organized conflict. This isn't to paint prehistoric humans as peaceful innocents, but the Hobbesian picture of universal prehistoric warfare is a story told about ancient evidence to support a very modern ideological argument. The evidence doesn't require that conclusion. Number 1. Modern humans are something entirely new. This is the one that cuts deepest, because everything we've talked about so far leads here. The standard story of human uniqueness goes something like this. At some point, maybe 70,000 years ago, maybe 50,000, something happened to Homo sapiens. A cognitive revolution, a behavioral modernity event. The lights came on. Language became fully symbolic. Art appeared. Long-distance trade networks formed. Complex social structures emerged. And in this moment of transformation, modern humans became qualitatively different from everything that had come before. We crossed a threshold. We became, in some meaningful sense, us. This story is deeply appealing. It places a clear boundary between the humans we recognize and the predecessors who were, at best, prototypical. It makes our uniqueness feel abrupt, decisive, exceptional. The archaeology won't support it. The behaviors we associate with behavioral modernity, symbolic art, personal ornaments, complex tools, long-distance exchange, deliberate burial, don't appear suddenly in the archaeological record of Homo sapiens around 50,000 years ago. They appear piecemeal in multiple regions over a period of 100,000 years or more, and they appear in other species. Ochre processing in South Africa goes back at least 160,000 years. Engraved geometric patterns on shells associated with Homo erectus, not Homo sapiens, not Neanderthals, have been dated to 540,000 years ago. That's more than 500,000 years ago. Neanderthal ornaments predate the arrival of modern humans in Europe. The Châtel-Perronian tool industry in France, which shows significant sophistication and is associated with Neanderthals, appears independently of any contact with modern humans. The cognitive revolution narrative was always a story about what made us special, and the evidence has been suggesting for decades that the behaviors we consider defining features of modern human cognition were not invented by us, were not new with us, and were not unique to us. But there's something deeper than just the behavioral evidence. The genomic data has done something genuinely strange to the concept of human uniqueness. We now know that the ancestors of modern humans outside Africa interbred with Neanderthals, with Denisovans, possibly with Homo erectus-related populations in Asia. We carry their genes. They shaped us. This isn't metaphor. Modern immune system function in many populations is influenced by Neanderthal genes. Tibetan adaptation to high altitude, the EAP1 gene variant that allows Tibetans to thrive at elevations where other humans would struggle, is Denisovan in origin. We are walking archives of extinct human species. Their DNA is doing things in our bodies right now. So who are modern humans? We're the surviving branch of a diverse family tree. We carry the genetic legacy of species we used to think were separate from us, lesser than us, evolutionary failures. The behaviors that supposedly define us, art, language, ritual, long-distance exchange, predate us, appear in other species, emerged gradually and independently across thousands of generations. The story we told ourselves of a sudden, decisive moment when real humanity appeared, distinct from everything before, was always a story about self-importance. The prehistory of our species doesn't support it. What it shows instead is something more humbling and more interesting, that the things we value most about being human are older than our species, distributed across relatives we dismissed, and that we are less a destination than one more moment in a very long story. That's something worth getting right.